Hello and welcome to Public Health and Real Life. I'm Ashwin Kadambi. On the occasion of our 25th guest interview we are celebrating, I wish myself and Dr. Maimouna Alex Adiomi wish to extend our gratitude to every public health expert who has been on our show, whose support, encouragement, and participation have made it possible for us to grow our initiative. And it has enabled our channel to enjoy the respect and reputation among the public health sphere as well as from public health thought leaders. We look forward to many more informative webinars, educational videos, and more importantly, the opportunity to tell the stories of public health heroes. Today, we have a public health distinguished expert who has dared to study a topic and tell a story that is usually neglected and remains a silent reality. That is the personal and professional impact of graduate students who pursue global health fieldwork. And I'm joined today by two highly accomplished panelists who will participate in the discussions today and take part in the Q&A. I have Srishti Sardana and Dr. Brittany Rivero. We will include their bios in the description section below. So let's bring Srishti on board and let me introduce her. So Srishti is a former corrections officer in India, working with the Delhi Juvenile Justice Aid, with the Delhi Police, and she's also a co-founder of the mental health nonprofit in India, and currently a doctoral candidate, and is a scientist practitioner with clinical interests in the study of deep depression, HIV/AIDS, and mental illness comorbidities. And her research expertise is in social capital, networks, and determinants of mental health among underserved populations, including sex workers, juvenile sex offenders, refugees, and displaced populations globally. She's also working she's currently a doctoral candidate and lab coordinator of the Global Mental Health Lab at Teachers College, Columbia University. Welcome to the show, Srishti. Okay, and then we have our second panelist, Dr. Brittany Rivero. Dr. Brittany Rivero earned a master's degree and a doctor of psychology in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She's currently completing a postdoctoral fellowship at St. Joseph's University Counseling and Psychological Services, where she works with college students presenting with a variety of mental health concerns. Brittany previously completed part of her training with the DC Superior Court, completing psychological assessments with juvenile offenders. Additionally, Brittany has experience completing neuropsychological assessments with individuals ranging in the age from 20s to 80s. Brittany's clinical areas of interest are LGBTQ plus issues, eating disorders, and anxiety disorders. Brittany is passionate about providing therapy in university counseling centers. Additionally, she enjoys providing supervision to clinicians in training and hopes to one day become a training director. Welcome to the show, Brittany. And we are also pleased to have Brittany introduce our distinguished guest.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for that welcome. So we are honored to be joined today by Corey McAuliffe, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Nursing, University of British Columbia in Vancouver, British Columbia. She earned her doctorate in public health from the University of Toronto and a Master of Public Health with a concentration in global health from Emory University. Corey has over 15 years of experience in global and public health practice and training with academic, governmental, and non-governmental organizations. Her research focuses on researcher and student mental health and well-being, safe work environments, trauma and distress, embodiment, disability, and critical global health. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Welcome to the show, Corey. And with no further ado, we are all looking forward to your presentation. and we will follow that with a Q&A session. We would also like to, at this moment, encourage our audience to post any of your questions and comments in the comments box, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, towards the side of the video, and sit back, and we look forward to enjoying Corey's presentation.
So thank you all for having me today. In the next 15 or so minutes, I'm going to briefly go over some of the findings from my doctoral dissertation work titled A Phenomenological Account of Women Graduate Students, the Lived Experience of Global Public Health Practice. However, first, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional and ancestral keepers of the land on which I currently live. I am presenting to you from the Musqueam First Nations unceded territory, what colonizers have named Vancouver, British Columbia. And the research I will be sharing with you today was further generated from across Turtle Island, which many of us know as the United States and Canada. I would love to know whose land others are joining us from. So if people are willing, please share this with us in the chat or the comment section. And if you're not sure whose land you're on, I encourage you to go to the website native-land.ca, as shown on this slide, to find out whose land you are on. It's a great resource. And if you work with students or others, I encourage you to share this resource with them as well. So I believe there are quite a few of you here today who are either currently or have been part of the population group from which my research was generated. And if not, you may know of someone who identifies as a woman and who has participated in global health practice during their graduate studies. Thus, I'm guessing it wouldn't surprise you to know that most women in this line of work have experienced many challenges and traumas, and that global health practitioners as a whole are at greater risk than the general population for moral distress, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, stress, and anxiety. With this in mind, I'd like to bring your attention to 5 key themes that women experience in global public health practice derived from my research that I will soon return to in more detail. The first is the experience of sexual violence, harassment, and gender discrimination. Connected to this is the hidden labor of women working to keep themselves safe from sexual and gender-based violence. Next is the discomfort with privilege that women feel due to their global public health practice. Connected to this are mental health impacts of this work, especially in relation to depression. And finally, the feeling of not being heard or feeling unable to share the full breadth and depth of their experience. The phenomenon of women graduate students participating in global public health practice has not been given the attention it so greatly deserves. Women students face increased risks to their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Having been a woman working in this field and experiencing my own trauma and distress led me to see that many of my stories did not fit into the traditional global health narrative. The silencing of our experiences is precisely why I decided to embark on this research. Thus, I decided to look at these 2 central research questions. The first, what is the lived experience of a US or Canadian woman graduate student participating in global public health practice, elucidates rich and descriptive themes and stories. While the second, how does a Canadian or US woman graduate student experience global public health practice, attends to a process-oriented perspective. While I don't have time today to go into my methodology and inclusion criteria, I did want to show the depth to which women wanted to participate in this study. Originally, I had almost 50 people identify interest within a 2-week period. I ended up selecting 7 women to participate in multiple in-depth interviews and invited the remaining women to participate in a guided writing exercise, of which 18 women sent in their stories. Through my phenomenological methodology, I then recrafted 366 total stories from the interviews and written stories of these women. Participant stories reflect experiences from more than 20 countries, including throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast and Southern Asia, and the Middle East. The 25 study participants attended a total of 14 different universities at the master's and/or doctoral levels. The stories I will share within this presentation come from co-constructed, crafted stories that have been aligned to create a woman graduate student's story. Thus, the character's voice within the stories you will hear is at once any global public health woman graduate student, and yet no one specific graduate student. At the core, the stories speak to the potential experience that we each have had, could have, or could see ourselves having if standing in her shoes. Before sharing some of these stories, I would first like to bring attention to some important considerations that impact the stories I will present. I recognize, and my research makes it clear, that safety considerations for the labor of women students is compounded when looking at intersectional ways of being. While I captured many ways a student can be, including racial and national backgrounds, and lesbian and queer women, I recognize that I have not adequately captured and at times completely missed the complexities of intersectional ways of being. This is a limitation I acknowledge within my research and methodological framing. As the co-creator of these stories, my positionality inherently impacts the way in which other stories are being shared. Being a woman, global health scholar and practitioner, being white, cisgender, heteronormative, living with a chronic episodic disability are all orientations that greatly impact my work and how I show up in these spaces. While the stories are directly derived from the participants, it is important to note that the method of restoring inherently weaves my voice throughout the narrative. So you'll recall from the beginning of the presentation that I highlighted 5 overarching experiences. These are key themes that emerged from my research, which I will now describe in more depth, along with a story to illustrate each experience. According to my research, women students participating in fieldwork often experience varying types of sexual violence, including assault, harassment, and gender discrimination. These experiences were perpetuated most often from individuals in positions of power. For example, supervisors and mentors, doctors, government officials, and organizational directors, but also by colleagues in public spaces and in the communities where students lived. Women who reported having these experiences often did not share this information with others, as they felt they had done something wrong, could have prevented the experience from happening, or that nothing would be done about it. Furthermore, these types of experiences were exacerbated for women who identified as lesbian or queer, especially fearing for their safety in countries where homosexuality is or was illegal, and at times compelled them to discontinue participation in global public health altogether. My first few global health experiences were filled with sexual harassment and violence from men in positions of authority. It took me a long time to see that pattern and realize I didn't do anything wrong. I was always trying to fix myself to fit into global health. Talking to other women who had similar experiences made me feel like maybe we are not the problem. Connected to the first challenge is the significant burden of hidden labor that women students perform to keep themselves safe from sexual and gender-based violence. A student's loss of environmental familiarity, plus her subordinate role as a student, means she must develop strategies and management techniques in order to reduce her experiences of sexual and gender-based violence. However, these negotiations can lead to either an increase or a decrease of her hidden labor. In the end, if she can avoid, mitigate, or reduce explicit experiences of sexual and gender-based violence due to her hidden labor, she may not have anything of substance to report. I can't tell you that he did this specific thing to me as I can with past people, but the reason nothing happens is because I don't let it happen. I learned to listen to myself. I learned to trust myself. I learned to manage him, or I learned to manage my circumstances. If I'm walking a certain way and he's coming, I turn and I walk the other way. If I see his car, I know what office he's in. I don't go there. My way of dealing with it is avoidance. I do that for 6 months. It's a lot of work to avoid people, but it's the price I pay to do the work I want. Although participants came from different backgrounds, all women spoke to a discomfort with their privilege, often expressed in reference to their position as residents of the global north, including those who completed fieldwork in countries of familial origin. The women questioned the inequities they witnessed, why their work was deemed more valuable than that of local community members, and the benefits they received. Feelings of guilt, including professional benefits, were exacerbated once they returned home. Their hyper-awareness of inequities led some participants to feel that their difficulties were invalid or not bad enough to warrant the time and space needed for processing their experiences. These feelings of inequity also led participants to recognize a fissure or a dissonance in their two worlds, feeling as if they were simultaneously living two lives and never feeling whole. My fieldwork left me questioning, what do I do with this information? Why are women in this country going through so much? Why do I have the privileges I have? Even though I'm not really privileged in North America, when I did my fieldwork, it was clear how privileged I was. Sitting in between these two worlds is really hard. Some of these women have the same name as me, or are family members or cousins, but their parents weren't able to get out like my parents. That one thing alone means we lived completely different lives. I could have been that woman. Women reported a wide variety of mental health challenges, including witnessing or experiencing trauma or violence, sensitive data collection, moral distress, and a lack of time to process and reflect on experiences. Further mental health challenges related to returning home included anxiety, feelings of being overwhelmed, panic attacks, and PTSD. Women's experiences of discomfort with privilege and feelings of depression often intensified as they returned home. Women expressed feeling unable to speak freely about their depression within academic settings. Furthermore, returning to the data meant facing memories from a challenging time period or acknowledging unresolved challenges and traumas. A fundamental shift in one's sense of self was a common experience that led to feeling alone or not understood. For those who sought out mental health services, they often did not know how to proceed or where to find accessible and affordable services. Some attempted to utilize university services, but felt that their efforts were dismissed. People asked me, so how was it? Tell me all the things. I couldn't articulate to someone who wasn't there what it was like. I should have been happier to be back, but I was in a weird funk. It lasted a few months to the point where I thought, this is not okay. I need to seek help. Not because I was worried, I was just really depressed every day. It was gross. At one point, I went to the university and tried to get a referral to a counselor, and it was brutal. There was nothing. I was reaching out, I was trying to seek help, and it was not taken seriously at all. Throughout data creation, a message expressed by interviewees was that as students, they did not feel safe sharing their full experiences of fieldwork. Some participants were surprised by their own emotional reactions to the stories they shared with me, assuming their experiences weren't that intense or had already been processed. Many women felt that challenging or traumatizing fieldwork experiences were like badges of honor, to be collected or a way to join the club. They felt reluctant within academic spaces to identify these experiences as negative for fear that they had failed the test. Thus, they often remained silent or selectively shared their stories. I'm surprised by how much these conversations brought up things I hadn't thought about in a long time in ways I hadn't considered. It brought up emotions I wasn't anticipating. I felt, wow, this is some stuff I haven't fully processed yet, when I believed I had finished processing it years ago. I'm grateful for the opportunity to reflect and surprised at how much it impacted me, even days later. I hadn't thought my experiences were intense. I had compartmentalized them and thought of them as normal global health experiences. But then again, it is the norm for global health, but it's not normal, or not the way it needs to be. I'm hoping that these selected stories begin to illustrate the depth and breadth of the types of experiences that I was able to uncover with this research. But you may wonder, what does this mean for the field of global public health? What does this research leave behind and set a path forward for? With this research, it is imperative to acknowledge and validate that current structures and systems enable a plethora of adverse experiences towards graduate students, especially women. These harms cannot continue to be silenced, suppressed, or implicitly condoned. Thus, I call on universities to commit to creating safer learning environments, providing more comprehensive training, resources, and supports, and requiring more protective and reflective measures at both the individual and structural levels. Universities have an ethical duty of care to students and should provide adequate financial compensation, safe spaces for authentic conversations, and time for processing experiences throughout the research cycle and in the months and years following fieldwork. Universities need to create higher standards and quality for student preparedness, more accessible and appropriate resources and supports, while students are abroad and once they return home. This preparation must include students and consider gender differences along with other intersectional ways of being in the world. There is no easy checklist for universities to abide by. Rather, a comprehensive, process-oriented approach is needed. Finally, future research and policy decisions need to focus on the question of who is responsible for student safety and their well-being while participating in global public health fieldwork. While research ethics boards protect human research subjects' rights and welfare, similar protections are not mandated for students and researchers. With the rise in global health fieldwork, I argue that academic institutions are ethically obliged to keep students healthy and well supported, just as they are obligated to do for their employees. Graduate students, whether paid, unpaid, or underpaid, are workers and deserve rights. While many regulations and policies exist to protect workers, students' employment status is varied and often not protected under legislation. Universities would benefit from considering students as workers and applying an occupational health and safety framework to support and protect students, both domestically and while abroad. The consideration of who is responsible for women graduate students' health and well-being in global public health practice is a critical students' rights and gender equity issue. Academic institutions have a duty of care towards students to fulfill and thus should be obliged to care for students by treating them as workers with rights. So I just want to acknowledge the wisdom and support that came from my committee members, multiple academic and research communities, and most importantly to the women who so vulnerably shared their experiences with me. And also a big thanks to today's hosts for having me on and offering this space in which to share my work. And if you are interested in reading more, here are some of my current publications specifically on this topic area. And you are welcome to reach out to me via my email if you have further questions or want to discuss further.
Thank you. Thank you, Corey. These are some real issues that usually is never known to the general public or even I think the professionals at the university setting. And because of these types of issues, we are prone to losing dozens of talented women from global health. And awareness is the key, and also preparation is the key. In this point, I believe universities would argue that they have a training program in place prior to students traveling to their global health fieldwork. How do you think are these training programs insufficient in preparing students towards these issues?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would first of all say that not every university has a preparedness training even. Some of my participants, and maybe they do by now, but when my participants went through the programs, some of them were missing and they said, or they had somehow missed it, like it happened on this date. And so they didn't get to go because, maybe they were doing their first fieldwork visit and so they were gone. And so first and foremost, not everyone had access. I remember one participant in particular stated that, yes, she went to the preparedness training and yet never once was sexual and gender-based violence ever brought up. They never talked about it. They had absolutely no idea what they should do if it happened. And she had said, all I wanted them to say was, this may happen to you. Here is what you need to do if it happens. And that's actually the current paper I'm working on right now is focused on the hidden labor of women keeping themselves safe from sexual and gender-based violence. And that was the biggest thing. It was just that it's never talked about, and there's no sense of where someone would go or how they would deal with it. Is it dealt with in country? Is it dealt with back at your host institution? And I have to call myself out actually in this. I used to teach the preparedness course at a university that I taught at, and I did a terrible job. I didn't mean to do a terrible job, but I was mimicking the model I had been taught. And so what did I say in that course? Oh, you make sure to wear the right clothes, make sure to wear a wedding ring, to which I didn't preface it as you shouldn't have to do these things. If you don't want to, you know, that's your choice, and we support you, and we will be here to be a safe environment. But there's so much unintentional framing of like victim blaming before something even happens. You are set up to expect that it is your responsibility to keep yourself safe, rather than here's what we have in place to support you and your well-being. So many of these students are going to spaces that have no one else. There's no supervisor. There's no one from their university. They have no other colleagues there. The university has not spent time developing long-term relationships in which students come back and forth between both countries. It's this, we send our students there. There's no financial or kind of intentional design to bring students back, which would be, again, another great way of this preparedness. Well, what if you had students from the site that's, you know, your students were about to go to? They could be the one to stand up and say, like, you know, these are some things about my culture you might want to know about. Here are numbers to X, Y, and Z people that can like also help you navigate and to understand. But we're so driven right now by like just granted, the pandemic has put in a whole new twist to everything. And so, you know, in a way, it's given such a pivotal, perfect moment to make massive changes, because kind of everything was stopped. Like students haven't been sent abroad. Everything has been paused. And so in this moment of the pause, like, could we have some reflections about, let's not go back to what we were doing before, you know, let's make it better. How do we make it better? And to me, it's a slowing down of those types of positions. It's having like full financial compensation for them, which good luck finding the university that's super excited to offer that. I mean, every once in a while you'll find something, but it's usually, oh, we'll pay for your trip and your housing, not your work. So I think there's just some big conversations that need to happen before we move forward with that.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned a lot about the emotional and mental health challenges that many women do face. You've talked about the labor that women have to put in that they really should not have to. And you mentioned that depression seems to be a major issue. And something that came to mind was, for me, as I was hearing that, was, wow, these women are probably being put at a disadvantage when they return. Because when you're struggling with depression, it's very difficult to continue doing your work, your studies. And so I'm curious about your thoughts regarding how mental health challenges might impact some of these women down the line as well, not even just during the trip, but also are women being put at a disadvantage beyond the trip because of the trauma sustained, or the way that things have been mishandled, it sounds like?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really important one. And based off of the research I did and the stories I collected, I mean, these stories were anywhere from, they had to at least be a year out of their work, just because of my own recognition of like the trauma and distress that may come from the interviews. And so I had wanted them to have a little bit of time to process and to understand. But up to, I want to say, some participants, some of their stories might have been up to 15 years old. So they were, you know, usually it was people who had stayed in the field. So I had kind of stories from the past 15 years. But it absolutely impacted the long-term effects. I mean, I think in one of those don't know if I shared in that story, but one of the participants, oh, it's not in the stories, who identified as a lesbian and queer woman was so traumatized by her experiences that she has fully removed herself from the field of global health, will not participate in it, does not feel safe being in most other countries. And again, like her voice would be so powerful to hear in terms of what we could do, yet we've kind of lost her because she doesn't want to participate. She doesn't want to be within this framing. And so I just know that there's countless others like that. There were definitely participants who spoke about, like, I don't know that they had diagnoses of PTSD, but sure sounded very similar to that. I was most surprised, you know, I had expected anxiety, like being nervous about traveling and like kind of anxious pieces, but I will say I wasn't expecting to have every single one of my interview participants express a feeling of depression when returning home. Like that was mind-blowing to me that, and then it made sense. And I like focused back on my own experiences and remembered having friends call me out and be like, are you okay? Like, or like not invite me to things. And I'd be like, why are you avoiding me? And they were like, well, I'm not. You just seem like you're really processing. And I didn't want to overwhelm you with, you know, a big group of people. And I was like, oh, like people are this, and it wasn't something I was sharing. This was something people were reflecting back to me. And it's really challenging. And I think one of those pieces that I mentioned too was this return to data. Like you're returning to work that was in a very specific context now, and now you're in a very different context. So now you're in a context where the biggest problem may be like, where are we going out to eat? And that just feels so dissonant from what your data may hold, which may be deep inequities, poverty, you know, people not being able to eat, or people suffering or dying in childbirth, or, you know, a myriad of other things that when you were in country, that was contextually where you were at anyway. So you were living in a space in which that contextually was happening. And so it wasn't so kind of mind bending in a way of like, what am I dealing with here? And how do I merge these worlds where, like, you know, if you have a partner or family members or colleagues and none of them are in that same space as you, they don't get it. And there's not really, it feels like sometimes there's not a language to use to help bridge that for them.
And that ties so well with, you know, this notion of there's an aspect of being the other, but there is also an aspect of privilege. And I would have imagined that the fact that one would go from a relatively well-resourced context to a relatively lesser resourced context, there would be difficulty in understanding, you know, what might be going on. Mm-hmm. But what I'm also hearing in some of these deeply internalized experiences of these women researchers in the field sounds like either it's deep compassion, some level of burnout. I would have imagined privilege would have been protective. And you mentioned that, you know, you write about this notion of privilege in your paper. I'm very curious to hear from you. You know, what were some of the dimensions? How does it come up? What role it might be serving?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was one of the things I was least surprised by, just because of my own experience of being a white woman living in different countries around the world, and my own deep kind of distress with how do I deal with this, and what do I do with it as a researcher, and my own positionality and how that affects, you know, the research, as well as, you know, addressing and thinking through how I live in this world. And I will say, even, you know, more so recently, I think my experiences in global health and grappling with that sense of privilege has made me more aware and needing to discover, like, right here, right in Canada and the US, like, what is my role as a settler and part of the colonizing population, and the intergenerational trauma that has gone on here. So I will say no one needs to leave the country to deal with this or face this. It is in your backyard. And I hope, that conversations are being had. I feel very privileged to be in Canada, quite honestly, where there are deep discussions about indigeneity that I don't feel like, unfortunately, I had much of an opportunity to learn about, or that universities were bringing that topic up. I would hope that's changed. This could also be the fact that, a decade ago, maybe we hadn't progressed enough. And I would hope that by this point, those universities have instituted these conversations and are challenging students to grapple with these ideas and to look at, theoretical frameworks like decolonization, post-colonial theory. And there are ways that are coming up that we can start to have deeper conversations that actually help us, like, methodologically and within our profession to really grapple with these big concepts. But when you sent a whole bunch of us without any of these, like, words or these concepts or these theories, there was a sense it was there, and so you kind of can't ignore it. I think what did surprise me was my participants who either were born in these countries themselves or had families that were born and had immigrated. And I didn't interview people who didn't identify as Canadian or American or from the US, so I don't know what their experience would have been. A whole new level that I would have been really interested, or I would love for someone to look at. I didn't have the bandwidth to have my population be that big. But for those who, who spoke the language and whose culture, like, that they really identified with, they absolutely talked about this as well. And I think that is the story I shared within this presentation, was this woman going back to where her family had immigrated from and seeing herself in everyone. And this piece of, like, she really struggled financially to even be able to do global health work. So it's not like she was living large in the US or in Canada and, like, just, it wasn't a problem. Like, the amount of work she did to enable that financial burden, like, and to be able to pay people appropriately while she was over there, and to kind of move past these things. I think she's the one who said she came back and had 2 jobs plus a full-time student just so she could pay off her bills. So she couldn't go to any conferences. She couldn't go to, like, any of those things that would have then even kind of built it up further. So again, that piece of, like, that intersectionality of she's, that there are these complexities of wealth or race or gender, gender obviously, but sexual orientation and other components that really impacted this. And I will call my research out as saying I scraped the surface on that. I did not have enough. But again, is it that I just didn't have enough, or are these people more likely to not be in the field? And why are they not there? And why are their voices not present? Like, I think about that a lot with disability. Like, how accessible is the field of global health in the way that we have created it and structured it? Like, we're missing beautiful creative voices from those spaces. And absolutely, like, LGBTQ plus folks, I wouldn't want to go to a country where who I am is deemed illegal and that I could be arrested. Like, that would be terrifying. So again, how do we support the people in our spaces to be able to do this work, to get those voices, to get the creativity? I just, I can only imagine how much we're losing because of these structural issues.
Absolutely. And as you said, this pandemic is like an opportunity to actually work on some of those inclusion agenda to ensure the university provide that proper environment for everyone to thrive rather than limit their potential. Before we go to our next question, we have a comment from the audience. So we have a question, actually, from Mary Ann Harmer. Given the mental health and emotional trauma sustained, did your interviewees experience upon return higher incidence of physical illness as well?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I can't answer that with full knowledge. I can say that there were quite a few participants who did describe trauma around, usually it was gastrointestinal type stuff. And so I can't say what caused it, like if it was food or if it was due to the mental and emotional stressors that were then coming out as physical illnesses. I can speak personally and say I absolutely did. So I can only imagine that others did. It's such a great question. I wish I had thought to ask or kind of probe about it a bit more. I'm trying to think through the participants I have. I mean, there definitely were physical responses that people mentioned, but I don't know that they got really in depth in what they were. I do remember someone who wrote in about finding out they were celiac and trying to participate in global health, and that was fascinating. And something, again, you know, some of these stories were just kind of like, of course, that's so difficult, but like I hadn't thought about it. Or participants who were talking about wanting to get pregnant, but were being sent to Zika endemic countries, but they had to do IVF. And so they had to be on this very like strict timeline, and like they would have to tell their boss, you know, they maybe started the job 2 months ago, and they'd have to have a conversation with their typically male boss about their, pregnant, like this idea of getting pregnant, or kind of the really sensitive things that like people don't usually like go around sharing, and that are really no one else's business, but to keep yourself safe and well as a woman, it becomes this whole other level, which that is not to negate men either. Like men being sent to endemic regions as well would put their potential, if they have a woman partner, would put the woman at risk as well. So I do hope that people can see within my work that this is not just about women. It is about everyone in global health. I specifically focused on women because I thought there were additional pieces that I didn't want to miss. And I'm sure I missed pieces that are specific to men. And again, I hope someone else will take up this work and we'll look at that to see what we're missing and how that may be impacting them. But yeah, that's such a great question. And I have to say, I'm sure that there were a lot of ways that happened, but I'm not quite as aware of it. I'm sure like in an hour, I'll be like, here's a perfect story for it. So.
Yeah, but more importantly, as you say, universities need to take that kind of a responsibility to take care of students upon their return, whether it is physical or emotional, have that kind of a fashion, the workers' comp style care that's available to them if they need it. But I would like to go to my next question, and I would also like to get Brittany's and Srishti's thoughts as well on it. So, Corey, you quote in your paper that we must take care of ourselves before we take care of others. You also say that there remains a significant need within the academy to restructure and reform the way in which institutional supports and resources are offered, conducted, and evaluated before, during, and after international student placements. So what are some clear steps that academic settings can do to improve the situation?
That is a great question. I'll go back to my biggest point, which is that there's no checklist a university can have. And if they're asking for a checklist, they need to do some deep thought around like what they're thinking about and how they're framing this issue, and that this is absolutely very process oriented and iterative. It doesn't stop. So if you create the perfect pre-preparation travel, I bet you, had you created that in 2019, it is no longer perfect in 2021. Like, there's just too much that's happened in the world that has changed. And so again, like that iterative process of always coming back to like, what are we doing? Are we in conversation? And where are our partners? Like, where are these partners that we're working with? This idea of sending students kind of into the void and like claiming a partner because you had an email with them, like completely inappropriate. Mm-hmm. I, might not be, people might not love my idea the most here, but like, I think we need to stop sending students abroad until we have appropriate structures and systems in place to protect them. And that includes financial compensation. Again, that story I shared with one participant, like right there shows you that we're perpetuating inequity, and creating, tons of hidden labor and tons of grief and distress for those people who so badly want to, kind of follow this. And I'm not saying that people can't choose to go abroad and do their own work and set it up themselves, but then they know that they're responsible for themselves. And I think that's the big difference here, is that students assume they are protected and they're not. And so that assumption that whatever happens, like, it's all good because I've got this, framing or whatever. Even one of my participants was explaining to me, because then she moved into a job in employment in global health. And she was just explaining the differences of like, well, the first time I went, as a student, I was trying to live in like hostels or find the cheapest place possible. I was trying to take the public transit everywhere. But when I got this job, they paid for a driver to come pick me up, and then they took me to this hotel, and I had, security around me, which I'm not saying is necessarily like the way to go either. Like, then she was grappling with this idea of like, why am I living in such privilege when like everyone around me who I'm working with does not have access to their own driver, to hotels? And so there is this tension of, I have to live like a local, and I have to, be a part of the community. And again, that's where those partners are so crucial. Like, in some places, yeah, like you should be living out with the community, and you should be set up maybe in a homestay. And like the fact that, maybe people stay in these homestays yearly, and again, other people come back to the US or Canada to have those same type of opportunities. But then there's going to be countries where like it's not safe unless you are in a space with security, and that needs to be a conversation, and that needs to be something, kind of discussed and thought about deeply. But yeah, I guess I really want to come back, if I want to leave with anything in terms of what universities can do, is that they're going to have to change like the structure. This is not an individual problem. This professor who is awesome and like is the best supervisor is not going to fix the issue for every student. They might fix it for the one, which is amazing. And so it's absolutely imperative for the individuals to also be doing what they can do, but it is not on them to be doing it. This is an absolute structural issue. And these universities are making tons of money off of these students because they so badly want to go abroad. And my other question is, what jobs are these students walking into afterwards? Like, that's one of the other issues, is there's not tons of jobs in this field. And so thinking through, kind of what the purpose is and how to better structure this and support students, and to identify that they're workers. Universities have no issue slapping their name on that article you write. They will take everything they can in terms of like when you present, like, oh, we'll make sure to put our name on there, yet aren't necessarily giving the same compensation they would to their other workers, in which they have to, because there's legislation that protects them.
Sure.
And I'll just add one thought there, that I think the other side of it, with the structure, with the privileges, having been a global mental health field researcher and have been in contexts like Beirut, in the midst of what we know is going on there, and to Bangladesh, where there are the refugee camps, and working in a lab, in an institution, with an advisor, with precisely those tangible resources that you named, Corey. There's a preparedness plan, there is emotional support, there is financial benefits and packages in place beyond just room and board. Then because I'm on the other side and I'm acknowledging how unique my situation might have been, I'm like that outlier participant in your study who has the exact opposite set of resources. And I know that I am walking out feeling motivated for a career in global mental health. My physical and mental health is all right. My husband didn't leave me. And, I'm happy to put my university's name on my publication. So you're absolutely right that had I not had these key resources, I wouldn't have come out on the other side feeling the way I'm feeling today. So I definitely appreciate the candor and how essential, I would say kind of non-negotiably essential, this kind of systemic and structural support system is, because it helped me continue that sort of work. After Beirut, I knew I want to look forward to going to Bangladesh. I'm going to take on my next. Whether it was a requirement or not, it didn't matter, because I knew that I was functioning within a very effective infrastructure, and I'm not going to be alone in the field trying to figure that thing out. It's not going to happen. So I really appreciate you pointing out those very tangible strategies.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that's important too. And I did get those questions a couple of times. They were like, well, did they share any good stories? And I was like, yes, they share plenty of loving stories. I just wasn't those get, kind of prioritized anyway. So I didn't prioritize those as much here, but now I'm feeling like I want you to write a commentary about your experience and how good it can be when you have all those structures, and kind of naming them as such, and how much that impacted your ability, because we don't have that data out there either. And I think people would be shocked to know that actually could exist. And so to know that your lab does that would be a great step for someone to try to have a model to say, oh, look to them, they do it. Here's how they do it. You need to be doing it as well. Why am I not getting the same supports and benefits? So I think that's amazing that you work in a space that has realized what's needed.
And I'm shocked to know that it's unique. I'm so shocked. I read your papers and I said, I thought this was standard. How could you even do this without what Corey is pointing out? So thank you for bringing that to the fore.
You're the only person I've heard with this experience thus far.
Thank you, Srishti, actually, for bringing up, sharing your story. And Brittany, you work in an academic setting, and how can, as Corey has called for some pretty radical reforms when it comes to structural changes, or that's how the academicians would probably approach the problem, to look at the problem and look at the huge reform. They have to kind of break it down into policies and then convert policies into programs. This is the current model. From your experience, you can reflect on other aspects as well on what Corey has told, but what are some potential obstacles that you see in an academic settings from, I would say, copy and pasting the model that Srishti has shared?
I think that's a great question. So I want to be totally transparent that I haven't participated in global health fieldwork myself, but I have had clinical experiences in the US that, as you're talking about some of these fairly traumatic experiences, some of my training experiences haven't been unlike that, in ways that I feel like maybe I wasn't protected as I should have been, or wasn't advocated for. And when I tried to advocate for myself, it just wasn't acknowledged. And so I think one thing that I will get to your question, I'm sorry, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that I think we have a power hierarchy here that we're not acknowledging. We're looking at, if you think about the power hierarchy within academia, within being a graduate student, you're answering to advisors, you're answering to people who you want to write you letters of recommendation, who you want to think that everything you're doing is so impressive and that you're this amazing student. And so I think you have that. Excuse me, I'm sorry, my allergies have been bothering me here. So you have that, plus the aspect of being a woman as well. As you mentioned, a lot of these advisors are male. And so you're asking, just in terms of the power hierarchy, women who are graduate students to speak up and advocate for themselves. And a lot of times, I don't think graduate students feel comfortable doing that. And so I guess to answer the question, to take a cookie cutter approach seems kind of lazy in a way. I think each school kind of needs to cater their preparation to the program, to the students in the program. And I think there should be guidelines, but there needs to be a focus on tailoring it, I think, for the trip, the people, etc. And I also believe that we need to be setting up more mental health services. I would imagine that worldviews change, and trauma and just such incredible, in good and bad ways, changes to the way that people might view the world. And to say that they now have no access to counseling to process everything seems ridiculous to me, honestly, especially as someone who works in a counseling center at a university. I've been at 4 different counseling centers in universities. Like, we are there. And so it's a matter of, they don't even have to go far to access us, but sometimes universities don't allow graduate students to seek out counseling through the centers. Maybe it might not feel appropriate, I don't know, or sometimes people just don't know that we're there. So I think that's also important, is letting people know that there are counseling centers within these universities. Any major university is going to have a counseling center. And so I think that's also important too, just to kind of, being in that role. I think that's something I would love to see a client who had come from global health field work to be able to help that person process any trauma or worldview shift. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts that came up as I was listening to some of these amazing points that were being made.
You're muted.
Sorry. Sorry, yeah, but thank you, Brittany. But as you say, awareness is the key. That's the first step. And it needs to, there needs to be equal pressure from the grassroots level as well as from the researchers like Corey's, or rather research articles and studies that Corey has done. These studies have to be, there must be more studies to ensure that, there's inclusion and proper comprehensive training. Any final thoughts, Corey?
Yeah, I did want to speak to what Brittany was mentioning. Many of my participants did want to use their university's counseling. There wasn't access because there were like 3-4 months waits. The wait list was so long because mental health is in such high demand at universities. And so that's where structurally, again, and policy-wise, we can make it easier to say, and quite honestly, many of the graduate students, just even my colleagues, as well as myself, like, we want to actually work with someone potentially outside of the university. And so there are ways to also support and to lessen the intensity with which a counseling center might be seeing an influx of students. and to maybe prioritize certain types of cases in there, especially it's the undergrads are usually kind of who overrun the spaces, and that's often what the counselors tend to be most focused on and specialized in. So even those that did get to see counselors didn't feel like the counselors, and this wasn't just in universities, it was kind of all over, didn't have the understanding or language needed to be able to work with them through some of these difficulties of having been abroad, and to have the cultural understanding, or to be trained in trauma-informed care. And so there are conversations there and resources that could be set up of, you know, once a student finds someone that's amazing, or a few students find people and they're, you know, within the city limits, and you've got, you know, whether it's an insurance policy or an extra fund that, you know, supports that. Like there are ways to deal with this, and to still have the access. For some, one-on-one counseling is not going to be the answer for them. It's going to be more about peer-to-peer. It's going to be about, you know, groups. It could be about meditation, or about, you know, maybe it's yoga. Maybe someone needs something more physical to release that emotion from what they're dealing with. And so I love, Brittany, that you had said, you know, or maybe, I'm not quite sure who said it. Maybe it wasn't you, but whoever said the piece of like making sure that it's formulated to each space. Like it can't be a one size cut, like cookie cutter formula. Like it really needs to be, and that's not even just by university, that's discipline. Like the conversations I've had with my anthropology colleagues, like the reason no anthropologists are in this research was because I was forewarned. Anthropologists will eat you alive if you try to like, you know, like say that public health folks do the same thing, because they're not really ethnographers and they don't really learn like what it is to live somewhere for a year. And if you only went for 3 months, you're not cutting it type thing. And so right there, you know, was a cultural understanding of the discipline. In which like certain things are understood or accepted. And so are there ways where, you know, we can kind of come together and support one another and identify ways we are similar. And then absolutely that power hierarchy and structure is so embedded into all of this, and it's embedded into all of academia. You do not need to go into global health to see, almost like was mentioned, almost everything that was said. There are some specific things to global health fieldwork that I will say, you know, differ from the experience of those, but 90% of what I found can be used anywhere. It doesn't need to be someone going abroad. You can absolutely see that too with people working with Indigenous communities here in Canada and the US. And the understanding and cultural competency humility that needs to be in place, and deep partnerships and understandings and respect. So yeah, it's something that goes far beyond just the reaches of global health. And yeah, I thank you for this opportunity to get to share this work. I have found all sorts of ways in which it continues to be silenced in kind of mind-blowing ways, not necessarily just my own, but I will share one thing just because I find it so fascinating. And I didn't get to write it. One of the papers that I shared here was kind of more like a literature review, and I didn't have space to write it in there, but I think I ended up with almost 50 articles or so of like articles that it was usually one person writing about their experience. And I had found them. And when I first was looking, I found about, I want to say 15 articles. And I was trying to like figure out like who else was citing them, or where else were they coming from? How were they connected? And I went to a librarian, and she was looking to see if she could like map out like the other ways that they were connected, something you traditionally do in academia. And then you get more and more articles, and it's like, oh, that's how they're connected. And I went in and she started looking through them, and 13 of the 15 articles were not indexed. And meaning that they were not indexed meant that there was no way to kind of like trace them and track them and to put them in like company with other, and these weren't from journals that were no name journals. They were normal journals, and somehow the article itself had not been indexed. It's not like the whole journal had been indexed. And she looked at me and she said, I've never seen this before. I don't know what's happening. Like, I don't know why this is. And so I don't know the answer of why that happened. I don't know. And then even that first article that came back, it was, I'd say 75 or 80% of the articles. So they sent me back kind of a proof and had showed the things that they could easily like cite because they were in some of the major databases. And about 80% of them were unverified. And so they were not indexed in these major sources that we all use. So there was no way for me to type in that article and to see if it would pop up, because it wouldn't. And so it was literally like by scrounging around, trying to find anything I possibly could that I was able to like bring them together. But it was mind-blowing to me that was happening. And so here's another structural way in which these women talk about hidden labor, the amount of labor they're doing to share these emotional stories. And then again, to not even like have full voice to them, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's surprising the way these stories are being silenced. And when I read your paper and I came to this interview, I kind of thought I knew what the interview was going to be about, but really to learn about the depth of the problem through this conversation was much more eye-opening. And so thank you for highlighting this particular topic. And this is like really a call to action for universities and also students to speak up and have if there are students who are experiencing these kinds of issues, which seems to be fairly common also. So if they are facing, there is some studies have started to show that that these they are starting to be studied. So I encourage more public health researchers to expand on this study and include more demographics in your study and expand the scope of this particular topic. And we really want to thank you so much, Corey, for coming out today and talking to us about this topic, and also to Brittany as well as Srishti to taking part in this conversation. And as in public health and real life, we are committed to shining a spotlight on mostly neglected topics within public health, and also celebrating unheard heroes and unsung heroes. And today we are really privileged to talk to Corey and highlight the research that she's been doing. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Take care. Thanks.
We can stay back.